July 13th, 1943, 05:10 hours south of Prokhorovka. Mist drifted low over the rolling wheat fields as Oberleutnant Karl Weiss climbed out of the turret of his Panzer IV AOSF. Ostrz, the long 70,000 Kiokusek 40 L-48 barrel pointed toward a faint clatter of engines beyond the horizon. He had been awake since 0300 hours, reviewing ammunition totals, checking fuel levels, and speaking quietly with the crews of the 2nd Company, Panzer Regiment 2 of the 3rd Panzer Division. The regiment had been hammered repeatedly over the past 6 days of Operation Citadel, but Weiss's company, his company, still held a slender thread of coherence. 15 operational tanks remained. A dozen more lay broken in the rear, victims of mines, mechanical strain, or invisible shells fired from Soviet anti-tank ditches. At 05:12 hours, the first distant rumble reached them. The sun had just begun to rise, turning the haze a pale orange. Weiss raised his binoculars and surveyed a line of dark shapes forming on the far ridge, too many to count in a single glance. The shapes grew larger, more defined, and he recognized the silhouettes immediately. T-34, model 1942s. The sloped armor glinting faintly as they crested the high ground. Behind them, still obscured, the deeper thudding of heavier engines suggested KV-1s, or perhaps Su-152 assault guns. The sight sent a cold pressure through his chest. His regiment had already reported Soviet armor concentrations the previous night, but no one expected massed waves at dawn. At 05:15 hours, a forward observer radio crackled. "Find Panzer, Viela, Hundert, advancing in depth." The estimate came in under the strain of static, but Weiss could tell the man was not exaggerating. Dozens of tanks began descending the ridge, then more behind them, 2 lines, then 3, then columns spreading left and right, as if the steppe itself were unfolding armor. Soviet engines roared through the mist. Artillery in the German rear fired hurried salvos that burst far too wide to slow the approach. Weiss shouted orders down into his turret. Engines revved. Panzer tracks ground into motion. The regiment's thin defensive line began forming, but even in those first minutes, Weiss understood that the numbers did not balance. At 05:20 hours, he saw the truth. 5 kilometers of open ground now shook under the weight of an armored assault unprecedented in his experience. In seconds, the Soviet wave would hit not a prepared anti-tank belt, but his battered regiment, barely 700 meters from the first line of advance. And as more Soviet tanks crested the ridge, perhaps 200, perhaps 300, Weiss grasped the larger reality. This was not merely a local counterattack. It was a coordinated armored thrust, timed to overwhelm a German division already stretched to breaking. His regiment stood in the path of a hammer swung with industrial force. By 05:25 hours, the sun cleared the mist, revealing the full scale of what approached. And Weiss, hands tightening on the turret rail, understood that the moment had arrived when all tactical experience, all individual skill, all boasting of Panzer ace marksmanship would be rendered meaningless in the face of a system designed to break him through sheer volume. The waves of T-34s would smash into his regiment in minutes, and within 2 hours, they would erase it. Karl Weiss had served in armor since 1937, first as a cadet, then as a platoon commander during the French campaign of 1940. He had fought in Yugoslavia, in the drive toward Smolensk in 1941, and on the Long March toward the Don in 1942. By mid-1943, he possessed a reputation as a quick-thinking, technically proficient officer who understood the strengths and limits of his machines. His first Panzer III carried the shorter 50mm gun, then the longer KWK-39, and finally in 1943 he transitioned to the Panzer IV AOSF. H, an upgrade Germany hoped would keep pace with the increasing numbers of Soviet T-34s. Weiss knew that doctrine, training, and crew experience remained Germany's greatest advantages, but he also understood the mathematics of the war were shifting. Where German industry produced a few hundred tanks monthly, Soviet factories, especially plant number 183 at Nizhny Tagil and the Stalingrad and Chelyabinsk complexes, were turning out thousands. By June 1943, the Red Army fielded more than 2,300 tanks in the Kursk salient alone, with another 1,600 held in reserve. Weiss's regiment, after months of attrition, entered Operation Citadel with scarcely 90 operational tanks. By the second week of July, barely more than 40 remained in fighting condition. The German offensive toward Prokhorovka had begun on 5 July with a massive bombardment. The 3 Panzer Corps and 2 SS Panzer Corps were tasked with penetrating the southern face of the Kursk salient, cutting behind Soviet defensive positions, and causing a collapse that would restore strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. But Soviet intelligence, aided by the immense network of partisans and successful signals intercepts, knew the German plans well before the first artillery shells fell. They built layered defenses, minefields sometimes 2,000 meters deep, Anti-tank gun belts staggered behind trenches, and infantry strongpoints reinforced with wire and fortified bunkers. Weiss's regiment spent the first 3 days of Citadel clearing mines under fire, losing tanks not to enemy armor but to buried TNT, anti-tank rifles, and 76mm guns firing from camouflaged pits. By 8th of July, German units began to break through localized defenses, but at a heavy cost in time. Every hour lost allowed Soviet commanders to tighten reserves behind their endangered sectors. While the Germans relied on field repairs and limited replacements brought forward by rail, the Soviets shifted entire brigades overnight. If a German regiment lost 20 tanks in a single day, those losses would require days to repair or replace. If a Soviet brigade lost 20 tanks, a factory train from the Urals could deliver replacements within 72 hours. The differential in industrial tempo defined the rhythm of the coming collision. Weiss's regiment fought numerous sharp engagements against the 69th Army and later elements of the 5th Guards Army. They advanced through shell-pocked fields where knocked-out T-34s and Panzer IIIs lay side by side in smoking rows. Often, they found Soviet infantry dug inches from their firing positions, remnants of units shattered but not broken. Weiss himself claimed 6 tank kills in the first days of the offensive, the result not of luck or aggression, but of meticulous gunnery drilled into his crew since 1940. Yet the regiment was bleeding slowly. Engines overheated in the dust-choked air, idler wheels cracked under strain, radios intermittently failed. Most of the battalion's supply trucks had to detour around impassable ground, and the flow of 75mm armor-piercing shells never seemed to match the rate of expenditure. Soviet night harassment raids kept German tank crews half awake and half fed. By 12th July, Weiss commanded a company that was Panzer strength on paper but held barely 15 functional tanks. This exhaustion emerged precisely as the wider shape of the battle changed. The German penetration south of Prokhorovka threatened to roll up Soviet positions. The Red Army planned a decisive armored counterstroke for the early morning of 13th July. The 5th Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov massed more than 800 tanks, including hundreds of T-34s from the 18th and 29th Tank Corps, along with supporting armor from the 2nd Guards Tank Corps and elements of the 5th Guards Mechanized Corps. Soviet planners intended to smash into the German spearheads, break their momentum, and pin them in front of Prokhorovka's high ground. The attack would rely not on precision, but on overwhelming density. Multiple waves, staggered formations, and relentless commitment of reserves. Germany lacked the intelligence picture necessary to foresee the blow. Poor Luftwaffe reconnaissance due to weather and shortages meant German commanders knew Soviet armor was present but underestimated its scale. Weiss's regiment received only fragmented reports of strong Soviet activity along the flank. His battalion commander assured him that enemy armor concentrations were being monitored. Yet, as Weiss reviewed maps on the evening of 12th of July, he noticed the pattern. Their weakened lines sat exposed on the very axis Soviet reserves would likely use to counterattack. By midnight, rain showers had passed through, leaving low fog on the ground. Weiss inspected each of his tanks, checking for loose track pins, damaged shirts and side skirts, and weak fuel lines. His crews moved quietly in the dark, oil lamps glowing faintly. They carried 77 rounds of 75mm ammunition per vehicle, high explosive and armor-piercing, and enough MG-34 belts for close support. But the numbers bothered him. 15 operational tanks against any serious Soviet push would be a gamble. At 0300 hours, he met briefly with the battalion commander, who reported vague Soviet maneuvering to the east. No major assault was expected until later that afternoon. Weiss returned to his position uneasy. He felt the pressure of the air, the strange quiet that often preceded large Soviet actions. His experience during the winter battles of 1941 to 42 had taught him that the Red Army liked to strike at dawn when visibility spread gradually and when German armor had limited time to reposition. When the first engines echoed at 0510 hours across the distant ridge, Weiss knew his instinct had been correct. As he raised his binoculars and saw the mist part around the distinctive shapes of T-34s advancing in depth, he recognized not merely danger, but a shift in the balance of the war. German doctrine demanded precision, maneuver, and tactical finesse. Soviet doctrine, backed by factories capable of producing 200 T-34s a month, could afford to hurl massed armor even at high casualty cost. The difference lay in industrial scale, not bravery. As Weiss watched the fields begin to tremble under the approach of several tank brigades, he sensed the emerging lesson. No matter how skilled a crew might be, no matter how experienced an individual commander, numbers created by a vast industrial system could erase any tactical advantage. The wave of Soviet tanks bore all the signatures of a system that had prepared for this blow for months. Rail networks shifting battalions overnight, repair shops churning out refurbished hulls, fuel columns moving continuously from the rear, and commanders coordinating the movement of armor as if it were a single instrument. That instrument was now descending on Weiss's regiment, rolling forward with measured inevitability. Every minute drew them closer. Every second narrowed his choices. And within 2 hours, the Soviet assault would destroy nearly everything his regiment had left. The first artillery shells fell at 05:28 hours, their arcs barely visible through the thinning fog as they burst behind Weiss's forward elements. The impacts were scattered and imprecise, characteristic of the rapid-fire missions Soviet batteries executed merely to stun and disorient before armor closed the range. Weiss shouted into his throat microphone, ordering his driver to pivot the Panzer IV toward the left flank, while his gunner elevated the long 75 mm. The regiment's thin line, barely 24 tanks across all remaining companies, responded as best it could, engines roaring to life as platoons struggled to form coherent firing arcs. But the ground shook with a pulse that was no longer distant. Weiss could now see T-34s pushing downhill at full speed. Some fired on the move, tracer rounds whipping past in long red slashes that carved the haze. At 05:34 hours, the first German shells landed among the advancing Soviets. Weiss's gunner, Feldwebel Krantz, fired an armor-piercing round at 900 meters, striking a T-34 in the glacis plate. The hit sparked, ricocheted, then bit into the lower hull on the second impact, sending the Soviet tank careening sideways in a burst of black smoke. A second target fell moments later. Weiss's crew worked with practiced coordination, loader yanking fresh rounds from the ready rack, commander calling ranges, gunner adjusting millimeters at a time. For a fleeting moment, within the narrow confines of his turret, Weiss felt the return of tactical control, the sense that individual skill still mattered. But then the mist lifted fully, and the scale of the assault revealed itself without distortion. The ridge was no longer a line of tanks, but a rolling formation that deepened as more vehicles crested the rise. Behind the initial waves came support units, additional T-34s, Su-122 assault guns, and infantry riding on hulls and fenders. Weiss counted 24 tanks across the central axis alone, then tried to count again as another echelon appeared behind them. The number grew too quickly for any coherent estimation. This was not a battalion. This was an entire tank corps, advancing with the confidence that casualties could be absorbed without slowing momentum. By 05:40 hours, Weiss's regiment fired at maximum rate, the lines of tracers snapping across the fields like weaving threads. The battalion commander attempted to reposition reserves, but the left flank collapsed almost at once when 7 Panzer-Larfours were hit in rapid succession by a combination of 7 T-74 shells and low-angled shots from Su-122s positioned on the far ridge. Weiss saw at least 3 German tanks erupt in flames within seconds, their hatches blasting open as crews tried to escape. Radio traffic overloaded the net, panicked reports of penetrations, requests for smoke, warnings of flanking Soviet infantry, but much of it dissolved into static. The battalion's signals mast had taken a direct hit at 05:43 hours, and command cohesion unraveled. The T-34s closed to 600 meters, then 500. Weiss's own position now lay directly in the path of the central Soviet thrust. His gunner hit a third tank, then a fourth, but the effect was negligible. Every destroyed T-34 was immediately replaced by another moving behind it. Weiss realized the Soviet formation was advancing in rotating echelons, designed so that no single line absorbed too much fire. It was a method he had seen in Soviet manuals captured in 1942, but had never witnessed executed with such precision and scale. The Red Army was no longer improvising its armor tactics. It was applying doctrine shaped by months of preparation and reinforced by a strategic reserve capable of replacing every loss several times over. At 05:52 hours, the Soviets executed their first coordinated maneuver of the attack. A cluster of roughly 20 tanks shifted abruptly to the German right, firing as they moved to widen the breach. Weiss attempted to rotate his regiment's remaining mobile platoons to contain the breakthrough, but he no longer commanded enough tanks to anchor a flank. 2 platoons under his direct control were already reduced to 4 vehicles, each firing from partial defilade positions, carved hastily into the soft earth. His forward observer reported Soviet infantry dismounting and advancing through the wheat behind the armor, using the smoke of burning panzers for concealment. The situation deteriorated further at 0600 hours. A group of Soviet tanks, likely from the 181st Tank Regiment, charged straight into the center of the German line, their engines screaming at full throttle. 1 T-34 rammed a damaged Panzer IV, flipping it sideways. Another fired point-blank into a command tank that had thrown a track minutes earlier. Weiss's gunner fired 3 shells in rapid succession at close range, destroying 2 attackers, but the 3rd Soviet tank pushed through the smoke and fired a high-explosive round that shattered the Panzer IV's left Schürzen plate. The shockwave rocked Weiss inside the turret, bursting his left ear and momentarily blinding him with dust. His driver reported track damage, but insisted the tank could still maneuver. By 06:10 hours, the regiment's right flank lay in ruins. Soviet tanks were now pouring through at multiple points, some sweeping around the German rear, while others pressed straight ahead toward the divisional artillery batteries. Weiss attempted to withdraw his company southward to form a new defensive line, but the terrain offered little cover and the Soviet momentum was overwhelming. Columns of T-34s bypassed German positions, with complete disregard for precise coordination, relying on the sheer weight of numbers to force collapse. The once orderly battlefield devolved into a swirl of individual duels, fires, smoke, and frantic maneuvers as panzer crews tried to reposition under constant threat. The German artillery attempted to stem the tide at 0620 hours, unloading rapid-fire missions that blanketed the Soviet approach lines. Shells detonated in tight bursts that shook the ground, destroying several T-34s and forcing others to turn away. But artillery alone could not halt the assault. Soviet tank crews pushed straight through bombardments, emerging blackened by soot but still advancing. Weiss recognized the larger pattern. The Red Army was applying operational principles that assumed high losses as acceptable so long as the momentum continued. For the first time since the winter of 1941, he felt Germany was fighting an enemy whose systems, production, reserves, logistics, command, were all synchronized to deliver overwhelming force. At 0633 hours, Weiss's tank took a direct hit to its left drive wheel from a 76-caliber shell fired at close range. The impact sheared the assembly, throwing the tank sideways and locking it in place. Smoke filled the turret. Weiss ordered the crew to evacuate, dropping through the commander's hatch into the tall grass as the gunner and loader followed. They crawled to a shallow ditch 30 meters away, keeping low as machine gun fire stitched across the ground. Weiss watched as another wave of Soviet armor rolled past his immobilized tank, some firing toward the retreating remnants of his company, others accelerating toward the German rear positions now less than 2 kilometers away. From the ditch, Weiss saw the full collapse of his regiment take shape. The remaining German armor, barely a handful of functioning tanks, fell back in disorganized fragments, each trying to avoid encirclement. Soviet infantry poured through the gaps, firing from the hips as they advanced behind the tanks. German anti-tank guns, hastily redeployed, opened fire before being overrun within minutes. The regiment's tactical command vehicle burst into flames at 0645 hours, severing the last link of coordination. Weiss realized they were no longer fighting as a regiment at all, but as isolated survivors trapped amid an offensive designed to crush them through continuous mechanical pressure. By 0700 hours, the destruction was complete. The Soviet attack had needed barely 2 hours to break through, destroy or disable nearly all remaining German tanks, and drive the survivors into a chaotic retreat. The fields that had been golden and quiet at dawn were now scarred with blackened wrecks, burning fuel, and the silhouettes of shattered turrets. Weiss watched as a column of T-34s continued south, no longer engaging his crippled regiment, but pressing toward deeper operational objectives. The Soviet attack had not been about defeating him personally. It had been about erasing an obstacle that stood in the path of a broader strategic maneuver. Weiss remained in the ditch until the sound of engines faded. Only then did he rise, brushing dust from his uniform as he surveyed the battlefield with a numb detachment. He had destroyed tanks that morning, more than most crews could ever claim, but the numbers were meaningless. His regiment had been built for maneuver warfare, for tactical precision, for coordinated strikes that exploited German training and gunnery skill. But the Red Army had unleashed an armored wave powered not by finesse, but by an immense industrial engine capable of producing enough machines to overwhelm any defender through sheer density. The lesson settled over him with the weight of inevitability. Individual prowess, even at its peak, could not compensate for strategic imbalance. A single crew, or even a regiment, could not stand against a system capable of replacing its losses faster than they could be inflicted. That morning on the fields near Prokhorovka, Weiss understood the truth that many German officers were only beginning to grasp. The war on the Eastern Front would no longer be decided by aces or elite units. It would be decided by factories, rail networks, repair battalions, and the ability to move entire armies as if they were single formations. Courage could win duels, but systems, industrial, logistical, operational, would decide the war. Thank you for watching this World War II story. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.